So I'm calling this meeting to order. If everybody could please take your seats, because we don't want to lose time. We have three ministers here today. And welcome. I'm very pleased that we are able to have this meeting at this special time where we're able to bring the three ministers and the departmental officials all at once. We will be doing the 7 minutes per minister, and then we will go into questions and answers. And just to remind the committee that Minister Hajdu will be here for the first hour, and then she needs to leave. Her departmental officials will stay, and the other ministers will remain. So if you have particular questions for status of women, I would suggest to get those questions into the earlier rounds. And we have with us today, we're very honored to have the Honourable Patty Hajdu, who is Minister for Status of Women, along with Mina Ballantyne, who is the Head of Agency for Status of Women. We also have the Honourable Marianne Mahaichuk, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour, along with her official from the Department of Employment and Social Development, Laurie Sterling. And we have the Honourable Scott Bryson, the President of the Treasury Board, along with his officials, Manon Brassard, Assistant Deputy Minister on Compensation and Labour Relations in the Office of the Chief Human Resources Officer, and Renee Caron, Senior Director, Equitable Compensation, Compensation and Labour Relations Sector. And so we will begin with 7-minute presentations from each minister, starting with Minister Hajdu. You have 7 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, and I welcome the opportunity to appear here before the Special Committee on Pay Equity. And I'd like to begin by recognizing that we are meeting on the unceded territory, traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I also want to take a moment to thank this committee for all of their hard work on the issue of pay equity. As you're going to hear very shortly from my colleagues about pay equity at the federal level and within federally regulated workplaces, I will focus my comments on the issue of the gender wage gap, which is closely associated with pay equity. While definitions may vary, the gender wage gap is generally recognized as the difference between the total of what women earn in our country compared to what men earn. And as the committee knows, pay equity is defined as equal pay for work of equal value, where jobs are evaluated on their skill, their effort, their responsibility, and working conditions, and can be compared for their value in the workplace. Les deux sont liés parce que l'examen de l'équité salariale nous permet de reconnaître
The two are often linked because an examination of pay equity allows us to recognize the undervaluation of work traditionally carried out by women and to look at ways of solving it. Pay equity is only part of the solution of the salary gap between the genders. The issue is complex. The causes are multiple and require multiple strategies. No one measure, whether it is taken by a taxpayer or an organization or the government, will allow the government to close the gap. It's going to take all Canadians working together to solve the issue.
The need for action on the gender wage gap is quite clear. According to Statistics Canada income data, a woman working full-time makes 73.5 cents for every dollar that a man makes. Canada now ranks 80th out of 145 countries in the 2015 World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report for income equality between women and men. Just as there are marked differences in the distribution of work between men and women, there are also clear differences between groups of women. Immigrant women's employment lags 7% behind Canadian-born women and 14% behind immigrant men. And Aboriginal women's employment rates are 5% below that of Aboriginal men and 11% below those on non-Aboriginal women. This is unacceptable, and we do have to make progress. Alarmingly, studies suggest that more than half of the gender wage gap is due to unexplained factors that we either have not yet learned how to measure or are the result of, quite frankly, patriarchy, the systemic bias and discriminatory practices that have resulted in women being paid less than their male counterparts. Statistics show that while more women are now making inroads into all industries and occupations, they are still concentrated in lower-paying sectors, such as retail, healthcare, and social services. Women are also overrepresented in part-time work and are less likely to reach more senior positions. And of course, many women have greater share of unpaid work, including roles as parents or caregivers. The so-called motherhood penalty reduces the earnings of women with children by at least 9% compared to women without children. Conversely, Canada ranks first out of 145 countries in female educational attainment, according to the World Economic Forum. This makes it clear that we have a significant pool of talented women in Canada with the skills and capabilities needed for a range of economic opportunities. Women now make up the majority of enrollments in college programs, and the proportion of women is even greater amongst graduates. Since the early 1990s, women have made up the majority of full-time students enrolled in undergraduate university programs. As a result, women already represent nearly half the workforce. The sectors of our economy where women are underrepresented are slowly becoming fewer. In the public and not-for-profit sectors, women hold many leadership positions. And women are slowly gaining ground as entrepreneurs, senior executives, CEOs, and board members across the country, but challenges remain. Women represent just 19.5% of FP 500 board members, and 40% of FP 500 companies have no women whatsoever on their boards. So how do we make progress in closing this gap? Well, one critical ingredient is leadership. As the Minister of Status of Women, I'm very proud to be part of a government that has made gender equality a priority, an action that will have ripple effects throughout our society and economy. And we plan on making meaningful progress on reducing the gender wage gap across the country. We are leading by example. The Prime Minister made history by appointing the first ever federal cabinet with an equal number of women and men last November, and the federal government is now working to ensure that its senior appointments are merit-based and reflect Canada's diversity with gender parity as a key goal. Through the Status of Women Canada, we're supporting projects in sectors of the economy where women have traditionally been underrepresented, such as the sciences and technology sectors. We will continue to engage the public, the private, and the not-for-profit sectors to promote increased representation of women in leadership and decision-making positions. We know that when there are more women in leadership positions and roles, there are better outcomes for women. In March of this year, I announced a new call for proposals for projects to engage Indigenous women and strengthen the role that they play in their communities, as well as projects that empower women for political or community action. And we expect those projects to be launched later this year. And the review of our electoral system is also an opportunity to look for increased engagement of and for women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And our next speaker will be Minister Mahaichuk for 7 or 8 minutes.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people and the Métis homeland. As my colleague has indicated, our government believes it's high time that we move forward on the pay equity issue. As Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour, part of my mandate is to foster safe, fair and productive workplaces and to encourage cooperative labour relations in the federal jurisdiction. I also have the role of ensuring compliance with pay equity provisions in Section 11 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Section 11 makes it discriminatory for employers to pay men and women employed in the same establishment a different wage when they perform work of equal value. In addition, the Labour Program offers educational support to federally regulated private sector employers and Crown corporations to help them eliminate gender-based wage discrimination. The Labour Program can also refer suspected cases of gender-based wage discrimination to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Our government's goal is to stop this discrimination related to the undervaluation of work traditionally performed by women. Many studies show that systemic discrimination related to the undervaluation of work traditionally performed by women is not new, nor uniquely Canadian. Modern economies face this kind of discrimination to a greater or lesser degree. Figures from StatsCan 2015 Labour Force Survey show that women across Canada earn only 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. In the federal sector, a woman earns 87 cents for every dollar earned by men. Neither statistic is acceptable. Equity and diversity are priorities in our mandate letters, and Cabinet reflects its importance. We value fairness, transparency, and collaboration. We strongly believe in the principle of equal pay for work of equal value and the fair treatment of all workers. Some progress has been made in closing the gender wage gap. However, too many women still face unfair challenges in the workplace, and much more needs to be done. Achieving pay equity is a contentious issue. And there are worries about employers and unions trying to hash it out at the bargaining table. In fact, not all federally regulated employees are union members, so that approach would not work. We know we can do better. Gender bias is how women and men are paid is simply no longer acceptable. It is a question of fairness and equal access to opportunity, core values of our government and of Canadians. So we need to build on what we already have. 16 years ago, the government created a task force chaired by Dr. Beth Bilson to study pay equity and make recommendations. The Bilson report came forward in 2004 with 113 recommendations on pay equity. One of its recommendations was that we move to a proactive pay equity model that requires employers to review their compensation systems, identify gender-based disparities, and take measures to address them. While the overall assessment of proactive legislation was very positive at the time, there was little consensus on how to implement those recommendations. I'd be interested in your views on a proactive approach to pay equity in the federally regulated private sector. I am open to suggestions for freestanding pay equity legislation. But foremost, I am committed to making every possible effort to achieve pay equity in the federal jurisdiction. Pay equity is one means to a very important one, and we must do so. I therefore welcome the work of this committee and look forward to hearing your thoughts and recommendations on the most effective actions that we can take to make pay equity a reality in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Mahaichuk. And our next speaker is Minister Bryson, and you have between 7 and 8 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm delighted to be here with you, with my colleagues today, and with your committee. I also want to say that it hasn't been announced the reason why Minister Hajdu needs to leave after the first hour, but she is in fact receiving an award as the Mental Health Champion Parliamentarian of the Year from the Mental Health and Illness Association of Canada. So I think it's important to recognize that. Thank you. Very pleased to be here, and we appreciate all the committee members for having been flexible and the time to meet with us. Comme vous le savez, nous étions en faveur.
As you know, we supported the creation of this special committee, and we are pleased to see that your work on this vital topic is well underway.
We don't see this as a partisan issue. As we move forward on important social and equity issues around equality and diversity, we ought to seek to move forward as a parliament working together to build a fairer and better Canada. De nos jours, un écart salarial entre les hommes.
A gender wage gap in this day and age is simply unacceptable. At the Treasury Board, we have the fortunate opportunity to be part of the solution. Let me begin by briefly explaining the two roles Treasury Board plays when it comes to pay equity.
Firstly, Treasury Board plays an important role vis-a-vis pay equity legislation in the public sector. And secondly, Treasury Board is the largest federally regulated employer. We employ just under 200,000 people in the core public administration. So we have an opportunity to set a standard and to lead by example in pay equity. Government of Canada believes that in the principle, of course, of equal pay for work of equal value, this is a fundamental human right. That is unequivocal, and it's a basic principle that's enshrined in the Canadian Human Rights Act, framed by constitutional guarantees of equality. The goal of pay equity policy and legislation is to ensure the pay is based on the value of the work, not the gender of who is doing the work. And in 1977, the Government of Canada became the first jurisdiction in Canada to enact pay equity legislation in the form of the Canadian Human Rights Act, Section 11. But this legislation allowed for pay equity complaints to be filed, and at that time was actually the vanguard of its time. But the landscape has changed, and now is the time for the Government of Canada to reassess the method of addressing the issue of pay equity. My colleague, Minister for Status of Women, has talked about the gender wage gap and the measures to reduce it, but the gender wage gap in the public sector stands at about 9%, and it is better than the average age, which is about 14%, but we have no area to be complacent or to derive comfort from these statistics. We've got a lot of work to do. The Prime Minister has delivered on the commitment of appointing a gender-balanced cabinet, and this further underscores the importance of this, and it sets a real example, and it's having impacts in corporate boardrooms. I've been told by corporate leaders that in fact it's having an impact on how they look at corporate boards going forward, and it's going to actually raise the bar for corporate Canada as well. It's notable that on International Women's Day, the National Film Board of Canada announced that at least half of its production funding will be allocated to films directed by women. It's going to take all of us across government, across business, and to work together and make meaningful progress. In terms of making meaningful progress on this front, not only will we have to ensure that women have equal access to good jobs at all levels, but that we also make incremental progress in important progress in reducing the gender wage gap. The more we break down barriers and inspire young women and girls to pursue a wide range of careers, the stronger our country will be, and it all depends on us as representatives of the Canadian people to set an example. Bien que des progrès évidents.
While noticeable progress has been made towards gender equality, there is still a lot of hard work to be done, including on pay equity.
This committee has heard from a number of witnesses, and that much of the discussion has been focused on the pros and cons of the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Bilson Report, and the Public Sector Equitable Compensation Act, PSECA. These systems attempt to address the pay equity issue, each by implementing different solutions arising from various decision points. We need to understand the decisions that underlie these three systems, decisions like defining the scope of the model, outlining the dispute resolution process. Our government's answers to questions like these will be fundamental in crafting an approach to pay equity that gets it right. This becomes very important from an equity perspective. It also has very significant fiscal implications. As we focus on developing a more widely accepted approach, it's imperative that we learn from the mistakes of past attempts, and as we move forward, we don't repeat those mistakes. The committee's heard from multiple witnesses, stakeholder groups, putting in very good positions and input to advise the government. This committee's work is very important. It will inform our decisions as a government as we go forward. The process by which pay equity is enacted must be revisited. That question is not up for debate. We know the imperative of this. We appreciate this and support your work as a committee. Time is of the essence, and this legislation requires a sound development process, and we commit to SE maintaining consultations with stakeholders as we go through this process. We're committed to pay equity at every level, of course, including at the cabinet table. En 2016, les femmes s'attendent à participer.
In 2016, women expect to be full participants in the economic, social, and democratic life of our country.
In a balanced and responsible way, which is why this government supported the motion from the beginning. We do look forward to your guidance on this important issue and to your input and to your cooperation as we move forward. This issue doesn't just affect women. In fact, it affects all of us as Canadians. It's because equality and fairness is a Canadian value. So congratulations on your work. We look forward to the conversation here tonight and your continued engagement.
Merci beaucoup à tous les ministres.
Thank you very much to all of the ministers for your presentations and your attendance this evening. We will start with a round of questions. The first is Mr. Sheehan.
Thank you very much to all three presenters. That is very informative, and I too would like to congratulate the Minister of Status of Women on receiving that award as a colleague from Northern Ontario. Well deserved. My question is for the Minister of Status of Women. We know that the government has been working very hard on promoting gender-based analysis throughout all government work in order to ensure that all members of society are taken into account when policies are being created. How would greater uptake of GBA affect the wage gap? And can you provide some examples?
Thank you very much, MP Sheehan. I am glad that you brought up gender-based analysis. It's a core commitment, actually, in my mandate that we strengthen the use of GBA. And as you know, GBA has been sort of on the books for a long time that departments should be using a gender-based analysis in the decisions that they're making that will affect Canadian population. And we've seen a varying degree of use and success in terms of using those tools. So gender-based analysis essentially supports departments to consider the gendered impacts of programs and policy initiatives. It can also be used to address historic inequities, and I would argue even inequities in terms of income. It can also look at initiatives, for example, that will strengthen women's labour market attachment that can help close the gap. So why do we have women, for example, that are underrepresented in various sectors or overrepresented in various sectors for that matter? Most widely known examples of this type in recent years have been the changes to employment insurance special benefits. So the implementation of a special range of benefits, and I don't want to steal my colleague's thunder, but in terms of EI changes that can actually provide income replacement for women while they're away from work, but also looking at opportunities to support men to have opportunities to take parental leave in a more fulsome way that allows women to re-engage in the workforce in a more rapid way or stay engaged in the workforce. Looking at using GBA when we're developing apprenticeships or skills training opportunities, and then of course strong GBA around as we move forward on an agenda of innovation, of science, of technology, making sure that we have policies, programs, and legislation in place that will allow women to fulsomely take advantage of those opportunities. I'd also like to say beyond GBA, I mean, we talk about this as being a human rights issue. It, of course, is a human rights issue, but it also falls into the category that good social policy is good fiscal policy. And women have contributed more to global GDP growth than have either new technology or the new giants, China and India, a fact supported by OECD and the International Monetary Fund studies. So this isn't just about human rights, although clearly that is the foundation. This is about actually spurring our economic growth through fulsome inclusion of women. Thanks.
Chair, how much time do I have?
3.5 minutes.
I'd like to share my time with Julie as well. Yeah, Julie Bruce. Sorry.
Thank you. My question is also for Minister Hajdu, and I was wondering, when you were talking, you had mentioned something about an unexplained wage gap. So could you please elaborate on what you mean by unexplained, and perhaps you could provide some suggestions to the committee about what tools you would need, if any, to address that?
Well, thank you very much. That's an excellent question as well. And I mean, I'm glad we're having this conversation in terms of pay equity being one component of addressing the gender wage gap. It certainly is a component, but it is really only one component. You know, we know that there are a range of factors that are influencing the gender wage gap. I've talked a little bit about some of them: overrepresentation in lower paying fields, underrepresentation in higher paying fields. Also, overrepresentation of women in part-time work, women's lack of representation in senior positions and on boards, women's greater share of unpaid work. And I think about my own experience, you know, raising children and all of the time that goes into actually raising children that prevents you from maybe possibly pursuing further education or training opportunities that might allow you to advance in your career, or even doing the very valuable networking in certain sectors that is essential to moving up in the ranks. The discrimination and bias against women, even though we talk about the progress that we've made in terms of women's rights, we still see in certain sectors a strong discrimination. When I talk about the Prime Minister's role around leadership, it's really because he's exercising his power in a way that's sponsoring women into higher positions. This doesn't happen across sectors. Quite frequently, what happens is the senior leader says, "Hey, does anyone know of a great guy for this vice president position?" And 4 names of men come forward rather than any names of women. And that's because the network is primarily composed of men who are sponsoring other men. So there are a number of reasons that go into the gender wage gap, not the least of which is pay equity, but certainly a lot of systemic, cultural, and practical considerations. So if I have another minute, Madam Chair, Status of Women actually has a number of actions across the range of those issues, whether it's looking for ways to empower women to seize leadership opportunities, working with corporations and boards to grow the pipeline and make sure there are women leaders in the pipeline, looking for ways that we can actually work with our ministerial colleagues to address some of the legislative barriers for women to fully participate in the workforce.
With that minute. It's interesting when you talk about that, because certainly in my own experience, even in I practiced law before that, and you would see that there would be a huge dropping out of women as they moved through practice, and so that there's a big gap. And you mentioned about women being educated, that we have a high number of women who are graduating from programs, less so necessarily continuing on to be board members or anything. Has any thought been done at Status of Women about reintroducing women into the workforce, that gap, the fact that women are being pulled out for a number of years?
Yes, I think we are looking at how we can actually support women to re-engage in the workforce, but also become entrepreneurs and business owners. So there's been a focus as well as supporting women in ways that meaningfully support their own direction. But I do want to touch on what you're talking about a little bit, about the gap between the women that are educated in certain fields and then the representation in those sectors. And I'm being told to wrap up, but we can further have that discussion.
I'm sorry, Minister, you can come back to that in a further question, but that is the time, and we are now going to Mr. Albus, who has 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just want to thank all the ministers and your officials for coming, for the work you do for our country. Certainly isn't an easy role, but I'm glad you're here to talk about this important issue. I'd like to start with first the President of the Treasury Board. Thank you for your opening comments. I'd like to just delve a little bit deeper into the Public Service Equitable Compensation Act. Right now, the provisional or transitional rules are in place. Can you just give me your worldview on this piece of legislation? What do you think that, again, it's obviously untested because it hasn't come into force. Where do you start as someone, 6 months into the role?
Thank you, Mr. Albison. I've got to tell you, I have difficulty with PSECA from a couple perspectives. The way it was introduced as part of a budget implementation Act didn't start off the conversation well. And let me say, I'm not being partisan. I'm speaking as both someone who's been a legislator, but also somebody who's now representing a government. But I really believe an issue this important ought not to have been part of budget implementation omnibus bill. This is an important issue, and there was little or no consultation with important partners and stakeholders who ought to be consulted, who ought to be part of this process. This committee and the mandate of this committee in this study is a very important step, and it's only part of the consultation we have to do over the next period of time. What is clear is that the emphasis in PSECA on market forces is a bit of an issue, is a significant issue, in fact, because in fact the pay equity issues, the gap between pay between men and women is actually greater in the private sector than it is in government, and there's a real challenge in that government ought to lead, and there's a risk that we import some things that may not be working well in the private sector, and this is an area where government ought to lead. Bargaining agents have made clear their strong opposition to PSECA as it was brought forward in 2009. Two of the largest unions have launched a charter challenge against the Act on the grounds that it violates equality rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association. So we're concerned about that. And we want to consider what other solutions may exist. And any new pay equity law needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be developed with consultations, important and meaningful consultations with partners and stakeholders, including bargaining agents. And we as a government are averse to bringing PSECA into
Sure.
force.
Now, on that, Minister, and I certainly can appreciate the market forces comment, because again, it does seem to me when I read the material, and of course, when I read it, you, especially from the lens of the experience we've had at this committee, that does seem to give an opt-out clause that introduces forces that are outside of the public service. So I can understand that. But again, one of the things I would just suggest is to carefully consider the legislation, because there, again, to me, having a systematic way for every 3 to 5 years to have a workplace assessment done where all employees know the pay equity challenges, and then having a process where both the union and the employer have to come together and work out a joint plan where employees can step back at the end of that process and say, did our representatives do us right? Did the employer do right by us? And I think that's important. Minister, there's also been some discussion at this committee in regards to having a more open process, and perhaps it doesn't have to be in legislation. Perhaps it's just, it could be done through a policy, through a Treasury board, where if there's a conflict resolution process, an alternative that can be made rather than going through some of the longer provisions that are laid out. I know we had one union regarding the financial professionals that said that they would have benefited from that. And I think all of us here want to see these things get resolved early. Are you open to looking at alternative mechanisms?
Yes, we are. We're open to, of course, it's clear we have to move from the complaint-based to a more proactive approach on this. And again, I encourage the committee. This is one of the recommendations. This is one of the things that we are here as ministers, to actually engage and listen to your ideas. We'll look forward to your report, and that may be one of the recommendations.
And one last, if I could make a comment before I switch to the Minister of Employment, is that actually I attended the GBA Plus analysis issued by the Auditor General. Actually, I think Ms. Ballantyne was there for it. And one of the things that I think that might be helpful is Treasury Board obviously is a challenge function. Obviously, there's a role for your staff to play and each individual department, but I do think having some sort of mandatory training for ministers so that they can better challenge to make sure GBA Plus is being incorporated would be helpful. Minister for Employment, thank you, and I appreciate your comments. Now, there's some talk about the overall assessment of proactive legislation was very positive time. There was little consensus on how to implement the recommendations. Those were your words from earlier. We had last night two groups, the Canadian Bankers Association and then a group that represents many of the large employers from the federally regulated workplace. About representing two-thirds of employees had deep concerns about issuing a new proactive, independent, etc., because they view that there would be a new bureaucracy in place, new rules, a new mandate, when they think that there's a lot more to be gained by speeding up the current processes, seeing more funding, perhaps making use of the labor program that pre-exists, harmonizing with them. Are you set already on a particular model, or are you looking to see how you can improve the system? Because last night, Minister, we had Stats Can come in last night, and we heard from them that they have a number of gaps that makes it very difficult to assess the wage gaps, why they exist, why they persist. And from what I saw and heard from them, there was not convincing evidence that proactive legislation is the silver bullet that we might utilize.
Mr. Elvis, I'm sorry, but the time is up, so we'll encourage the Minister to answer that in a forthcoming round. But we are going to be moving on to Ms. Benson for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for making time for the committee and for your comments on how important our work is. And I know I speak for everyone. We feel that, and certainly hope to do our best and give the government the best advice to follow. How's that? Just a couple of comments to Minister Hadou just about the gender-based lens analysis. I think what I'd like to hear is sort of what is the role of your ministry in order to lead that practice in other ministries. We know one of the issues with pay equity is the fact that there's a lack of transparency of reporting back on where companies and governments are at. And my fear around a gender-based policy and a lens use that we won't know where it's at, who is using it. I think you can probably appreciate where I'm going with that comment. And I just like to see sort of whether there's been some movement there about how we might see that it's being done.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for the question. Essentially, Status of Women Canada acts as a centre of excellence for GBA, and we do a number of things to promote GBA, and of course we fully welcomed the report of the Auditor General that said that we could do more, and we also welcomed the additional funds that will allow us to provide more support for departments. So I am confident that we're on the right direction. I would hazard a guess, and I defer to my deputy, that we probably have never spent so much time talking about GBA in previous government. So I think that some of the elevation of conversation is also helping. I think the other part about that is having a full cabinet minister that is specifically tasked with addressing gender equality in cabinet. I would also defer to my colleagues, but I'm fairly vigorous about ensuring that GBA is applied thoroughly, or at least we are highlighting MCs that are not applying GBA to my satisfaction, let's say, in the most collegial way. But I would say that we do provide support to departments in a number of ways. We provide people with the training and tools. I love the suggestion that we make a GBA a mandatory part, and I would suggest not just for ministers, but for all parliamentarians, because I think it's something that we should all be reflective about, how we're presenting private members' bills, for example. It is not just ministers that are working on legislation and having interventions interventions and having conversations. We provide advice, expertise, and guidance to increasing capacity to implement GBA across the federal government. We are, as I've mentioned, encouraging engaging leadership around GBA, around the, what is gender-based analysis, why is it valuable, and again, using a multiple lenses approach to that. That is not just about social justice, about equity, but it's about actually the functioning of our country, making sure that the legislation, the policies, the procedures, I would even argue are, the things that we procure, worth being thoughtful about how this is going to affect, both genders. The agency works very closely with the Privy Council Office and the Treasury Board Secretariat, as well as other federal departments, to recognize that GBA implementation does require a whole of government engagement. And now what we're able to do with a little bit extra support financially is that we're going to be able to better track and monitor the progress of GBA implementation, which is really specifically answers your question, and then we're going to be able to report back on that. We are really looking forward to gathering more data generally about gender. We've identified a huge gap in terms of gender data through, inaction over the years. We have data gaps, and this is one of those areas, and so we'll be collecting data in a much more vigorous manner.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to now go to Mr. Mahajcik and welcome and pleased that you're here. I do like to sort of hear your comments. I believe my hearing of the witnesses around the table is that there was a lot of consensus here that we've heard about the 2004 Pay Equity Task Force around agreement and around some key pieces, and that is about having standalone legislation that is separate from others, that the need to have a focus on pay equity that's separate from the Canadian Human Rights Commission, that what we've done around complaints-based has not worked. So I guess I think many of us are going back to that task force and looking for ways that it can be implemented. And I wondered if you share that view of that task force, that there were a lot of people that testified, but there was consensus in that report around those recommendations, not on everything, but on the recommendations, and we certainly have heard that here at the committee level as well.
Well, thank you for the question. The Bilson Task Force recommendations were comprehensive. It was an enormous study. There was a difference of opinion from FETCO opposed it. But over the length of time, a lot of companies have actually moved towards addressing these issues. And when we looked at governments across the board, in terms of provinces and the federal government, only ourselves and Alberta remain to actually go through the process of pay equity. And I participated in the process, which is complicated, detailed, and quite time-consuming, both on the school board level and then on the province level. So it was informative and also insightful, and brought in fairness. Now, how we maintain a vigilance on that, I think, is important, and what you're doing now is reviewing all of the recommendations. And when we look at any system that took 30 years to get a resolution, like Canada Post, it obviously did not work. Payments are made to the estates of employees. They waited so long, 30 years, for a resolution. Clearly, the process we have now has failed workers, in particular women. So I look forward to your ideas. The idea of having a workplace pay equity committee is something that is functional. We work with it all the time with workplace health and safety committees. So there are a lot of new, innovative ideas. And I thank you for the question.
Okay, and that is your time, and we will now be moving to Mr. DeCourcy for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm going to split my time with Ms. Zirovitz as well. My question's for Minister Bryson, and first of all, I say thanks to everyone here for your commitment to gender equality across a range of issues, and certainly we know that closing the wage gap is a complex issue, but we have received testimony and evidence that does show that moving forth with pay equity in a proactive manner can play a role there. Minister Bryson, you spoke a little bit about some of your concerns as they relate to PSECA. What other petition or testimony have you heard that may cause concern with that piece of legislation? We've heard a lot about a need for expertise in looking at pay equity issues, and anything along those lines that might draw concern with the legislation brought down in 2009?
Well, again, I've expressed some concerns on that. The committee is studying some models from the past, including PSECA. We're looking forward to your recommendations. We agree that pay equity shouldn't be collectively bargained. Among other things, it would create log jams at the bargaining table, and it's an enormously complex issue, and it takes years to resolve in the largest employer. So, it's important to understand the relationship between pay equity and collective bargaining, though. Both have important objectives, and they're important to understand and to preserve. But there is a tension between them, and we need to understand that and to address that as any pay equity reform. But I don't want to, in terms of PSECA, I've expressed my views, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of the government in terms of our views on PSECA and the way it was introduced, and the need to have meaningful consultation on something this important. And we're looking forward to this committee's work, because this is part of the consultation with you as parliamentarians. I want to make one point, in that there has been some progress within the public service from, I'm told, 1999, when there was a 17% pay gap, to 2003, 2004, was around 14%, down to around 9% in 2013. There's been some progress. There are some reasons behind that. We have seen, in terms of the pay gap within the public service, there is an occupational segregation within the public service. So we may have right now 56% of the federal public service is women, but there's more women than men doing lower paid work, and there are more men doing work that are in higher paid fields like engineering, for instance, and computer systems. There has been some specific progress. For instance, 46% of senior and executive ranks are women now, compared to 35% in 2004, 2005. 56% of the economics and social science group, compared to 53% in 2004, 2005. 57% of the law group, compared to 51% in 2004, 2005. 47% of the commerce officer group, compared to 40%. There has been some progress, but we need to do more. And one of the things we want to do more is attract millennials to the public service, and we believe that has the capacity to really move the needle in terms of gender balance within the public service as well. In terms of, we can talk about that on a subsequent question as well.
Certainly. And I think a lot of the testimony that we've heard would reflect that fact, that people do recognize the advances that have been made, but certainly see much more that needs to be done. And I'll certainly pass the rest of my time to Ms. Zarevich.
Much. I too want to say thank you very much for being here, for thinking it's important to be here, for your wonderful presentations. I also just want to reiterate a comment, because I do think it's very important. We've had a number of presentations over the last few weeks, and I would say that the majority of the people that's come before this committee has overwhelmingly supported some type of proactive pay equity model. So I didn't want you to get the impression that that wasn't the case, even though we did have a couple of groups last night that indicated otherwise. I have a couple of questions. The first is to Minister Mahaichuk. You had talked about the Labour program being able to refer suspected cases of gender-based wage discrimination to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. My understanding is that over the last 5 years, there's not been any referrals. Do you know why that's the case? And if there's anything that can be done about that? If you could speak to that, I'd be grateful.
Yes, that's true. No cases have been referred, and I think it's a reflection of the previous government's priorities. The department is small, it's overtaxed, they've seen a reduction of support for staffing, and they've been focusing on workplace health and safety. And so there have been no referrals. This would, I think it's a matter of priorities, and that was the case, that none have been forwarded over the last 5 years.
Perfect. And my next question is to Minister Bryson. The Bilson report made it very clear, one of their very clear recommendations was that pay equity should not be included in the collective bargaining process for a number of the reasons that you've mentioned. What role, if any, do you see unions paying in pay equity legislation?
Well, firstly, we meet with union leaders on an ongoing basis, and for instance, there was a few weeks ago, I guess it was maybe even a couple months ago, we released a report on mental health that was attained in the cooperative work between the government and public sector unions led by the Joint Council. This is one of the areas where there's a lot of common ground between public service unions and the Government of Canada. Incidentally, that mental health report was commenced under the previous government, under Tony Clement when he was in my job, and but there are important areas of social progress, social and economic progress, including pay equity, including mental health and others, where there is a significant level of common ground with organized labor, including public service unions, and these are areas that we want to work with them, including a proactive pay equity system, which we believe is.
Thank you. That is the time. Thank you very much. Our next question will be from Ms. Gladue for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, ministers, for being here. We do appreciate your time and the work that you do. So we've been hearing lots of different witnesses, and a lot of the discussion has come from the 2004 report. And I think, we've heard unanimously that a pay equity committee within every organization is a key part of the success. On the legislation part of it, we've heard varying things. I mean, Minister Bryson, your point about the improvements that have happened in the federal government to close the wage gap without the legislation really being there, it's fair, and that's the same message we heard from the Canadian banks and some of those. That said, we see that Quebec has the narrowest gap. They're lowered to 8%. But that Nova Scotia's legislation produced the biggest improvement in a short period of time. And when we start looking at the time frame of how do we close the gap quickly, they told us the Quebec legislation took 2 years from the beginning when they started crafting it to the time it was implemented, which is hugely long. So I definitely want to encourage Ms. Ballantyne, continue your efforts on trying to encourage women in STEM, women on boards, women that are underrepresented. Those areas will close the gap in a much faster way. There was unanimous agreement that the existing complaint resolution, 15 years for 30 million is not working for anyone, and so there definitely needs to be some mechanism that is a faster resolution mode. But that said, it's not clear to me still whether the legislation is really needed or not. And then when you talk about addressing the gap, now you're down to the last 9% in some areas, like in the federal government. And StatsCan has said to us, that's where these unknown factors, now you're going to need to do some research to figure out, what it is. Is it women leaving or whatever? So, Minister Bryson, would you support doing research with Statistics Canada to try to analyze that for the federal sector?
We want to have better data and better understanding of this issue. We have some indication as to what has made a difference, for instance, in terms of lowering the gap. The gap is lower, for instance, in those who are under 35 within the public service, as an example. That's due in part to, women are graduating in ever-increasing numbers from postgraduate and post-secondary and postgraduate programs. That's leading to higher paid jobs. There may be in that cohort less of, Minister Hajdu referred to the motherhood penalty, if you will, in a younger cohort. That may, these are things we we need to address. There are other barriers to women in the workforce that we need to, as a government, address both within the public service and more broadly in terms of public policy. But so in terms of StatsCan and other sources of good quality data, we want to be making decisions based on good data, good evidence.
Absolutely. Now, there's some people that think we don't want to spend more time studying to get that last 9%. We should just pay for it. Do you have an idea how much that would cost to do for the federal service?
First of all, there's a number of methodologies and calculations, most of which have been based on studies that have been done some time ago and have not been updated to current numbers. I want to be clear, though, when I mentioned earlier progress that had been made. You mentioned that the Banking Association said progress made. I did not cite that progress in any way, shape, or form to reduce the imperative of addressing pay equity. I think in some ways when you are addressing these issues, it's sometimes the last 9% that's the toughest and requires real action on that. I didn't cite it from the perspective of a self-congratulatory thing that we have an inertia here. I just want to make that clear. There has been some progress. I think that even on issues of gender-based analysis, the decisions rendered by a cabinet with gender parity are better decisions that are more reflective of the diversity at the cabinet table. That goes to any decision-making table, whether it's in a caucus room or a committee or within a department or agency of government. So we need to, on an ongoing basis, be rigorous in terms of demanding progress and measuring progress, and that's where the evidence comes in.
You'll be happy to know
that is the time.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But thank you very much. And our next question will come from Ms. Sidhu. You have 5 minutes.
Chair, and thank you all the ministers to be with us. And my first question is Minister Mahechar. How the federal government can better include immigrants and Indigenous people in federally regulated area of employment? What will it take to hit pay equity, and what barriers will be challenging to overcome?
Oh, that's such a big question, but very, very important. We released a study about a month ago showing that in the federal regulated sector, we have done relatively well in terms of visible minorities, disabled. On Indigenous, we're still below what is the average for the general population, but there's an incline. In terms of gender, we've seen a significant drop of the number of women that are employed in federally regulated sectors, which is very disappointing. I think that we need to be proactive. We need to lead by example, as our Prime Minister did. When we reach out and have opportunities, we must include committees or groups that reflect Canadians. And of particular concern is those minority groups like Indigenous people that are often come with so many challenges to participate fully. So we must take extra effort to ensure that we find a way to understand those things. I'll give you an example. Many Indigenous people will require time off work to participate in traditional cultural activities. Like they may want to go on the moose hunt. That would take 3 weeks. If an employer was to look at understanding culture, that would then produce an employee that would come back, would be very loyal, and then continue working. However, if the employer doesn't understand that that is a generally, that's a cultural norm, those individuals are often terminated. And I think that's also true when we look at, for instance, parental leave. Women will take maternity because it's often the best solution financially for a family. When we're discussing paternal leave, this would help women have greater opportunities in terms of their career. It would, of course, enhance the quality of life for the child, as both parents would be able to have an opportunity to participate. And so this is a concept I think has come to time, and there are so many different aspects of trying to break down what we see as the wage gap. And I think it will take all of us to be vigilant. Thank you.
And what would you say for the immigrant people?
Well, for immigrants, we look at the opportunity to do an understanding of the skills that many immigrants bring to Canada. Very sophisticated, very well educated, and sometimes there are stereotypes that hold people back. Sometimes there's a saying that let's just look at the resume and don't include the name on it at all, and you'll be able to then be more objective with your hiring procedures. So I think we need to be sensitive to culture, eliminate the stereotypes for immigrants.
Minister Bryson, did you want to respond?
Because one of the things that I'm very interested in as a policy approach to this is name-blind hiring. This is something that the government of the UK has implemented and moved forward with, and effectively, when that government is doing a job search, when people apply, their CV is there, but their name is not there until further on in the discussion. And what that means is that women who might be disadvantaged by somebody in an interview or in a consideration process, or people who may have a name that is for an Anglophone in a traditional setting, difficult to pronounce, or for whatever reason, that people aren't discriminated against. And I find it a very compelling and interesting model that around name-blind recruitment, and it's one that as President of the Treasury Board we are looking at quite seriously in terms of how it's working in other places. I think it could really make a difference for us to consider here in Canada.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we will now go to our next question. It's Ms. Stubbs for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ministers, for being here today. I have a question related a little bit to some testimony from a witness in yesterday's committee. She had said that one of the best practices of companies who are successful at achieving and maintaining pay equity is pay transparency, she emphasized, with consistent monitoring and enforcement, and that's one of the practices that set apart companies that are successful at maintaining pay equity. And just given your comments on your view about the government's leadership role on both gender parity and particularly in gender pay equity, I just wonder, first of all, if you foresee any issues or challenges that might arise from a lack of transparency of non-unionized employees whose pay grades aren't published?
Transparency in our pay scales within Government of Canada, core public service are, our
non-unionized employees that aren't
public. We have, we have, our pay scales for public servants, and these are all on the web. So there is I think that there is a considerable amount of transparency around what people within the Government of Canada are paid. I would agree with the importance of transparency. That's something that we're committed to as a government, but it is something that I think in terms of pay scales is already addressed within Government of Canada.
Well, given the complexity and the division between what are considered the private sector public employees and the public sector employees, I think there is differences in terms of the transparency and publishing of pay grades. So I'm just wondering your thoughts about those complexities and how you deal with that.
Maybe Minister Mahaichuk in terms of...
Well, in terms of, there would be a fairly high degree of sensitivity from the private sector on disclosing all pay, wages, and I think what we learned from past labor legislation or other initiatives, we try to build agreement and consensus and move without causing significant disruption. So for the private sector, this is clearly something that is confidential, and I've heard from business leaders that this is not an area that they're looking to divulge. But on the public sector, as my colleague indicated, our wages are open and quite transparent, and for many unions, that's also the case. So that would.
Okay, thanks, Minister. And then also on the issue of federal contractors, I think because it's been commented on here on both counts in terms of both gender parity and gender pay equity, do you foresee, and I'd welcome comments from both ministers, do you foresee going forward, particularly if there's the implementation of a proactive pay equity regime, that both gender parity and gender pay equity, given your government's stated commitment to leadership on this issue, would those measures both become conditions for private sector recipients of federal contracts, subsidies, and grants?
Well, if I...
Do you want to start, or
Sure. I mean, either way, I mean, I understand why the Billson report, for instance, was interested in this issue and using the federal contractors program as a way of increasing the number of organizations that would be subject to a new pay equity regime. But all the federal contractors program contractors are under provincial jurisdiction, and over 77% are headquartered in Ontario or Quebec, as an example. And that would cover 84% of the employees. So we need to give some careful thought to that and work with our provincial partners as well. Like so many of these issues, it's one that we would address with other levels of government as well.
Foresee making these measures as a condition for any potential federal public subsidization or granting to either federal contractors or private sector
we'd
organizations?
Be interested in, I mean, your work at the committee, and if this is something you would consider or recommend. We're looking at your recommendations ultimately, but we're also taking into account witness testimony of this committee as well. You're informing. These hearings are not only informing your deliberations as a committee, we're paying attention to them as well and benefiting from the work you're doing. So
thank you very much.
We're interested.
Thank you, and we're on to our next question. It's for Ms. Zarowitz for 5 minutes.
Okay, that was unexpected. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions. The first is to Minister Mahajcik, although I always welcome any wise words from Minister Bryson. One of the other, in talking about scope, we've talked quite a bit about what the scope of any type of proactive pay equity model might include. And so one of the recommendations from the Billson report is that all employees within the federal jurisdiction should be covered, including non-unionized, temporary workers, employees of parliament, and federal contractors. I want to know if you had any thoughts on the scope and what this committee should consider. So that's my first question. And then I'm also going to ask at once to Minister Bryson. I'll ask a question to him. Minister Bryson, you indicated that any type of pay equity legislation will have wide-ranging fiscal implications. If there's anything you could share with us on that front, whether there's some data or more information, I'd be grateful if you could share that with the committee. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I'll start out with the issue of who should be covered in something like pay equity. I actually think that it's related to job type, not whether you are unionized or not unionized, whether you work part-time or not part-time. So it's basically what type of job you do, and that's where the analysis needs to occur. In terms of federal contractors as well, it's important to note that In Ontario and Quebec, there is a proactive pay equity system. 84% of those companies, of the companies in the federally regulated contractors, actually are from Ontario and Quebec and have been covered by that proactive legislation. So that's a fairly comprehensive number, and many of the companies are actually complying with those standards.
Just, sorry. There's a, you mentioned in terms of Bilson, one of the things I want to mention in terms of the Bilson recommendations, and you mentioned one of the recommendations. Another one was the establishment of pay equity committees, and it's important that that we have balance between employer and employees in terms of these committees. That's something that's very important to consider. I think Ms. Bilson at that time may have had, I think the Bilson report was 2/3 potentially employee. It's important to have a balance between employer and employee in terms of these pay equity groups. So we believe that's important. In terms of the figure, there's a range, and they're quite dated, to be honest. And they're based on analysis that is really out of date, and we have to, first of all, you land on, there are a number of methodologies to use, but they are all right now are based on older data. So that's something. So I would be it would be folly for me to put out figures that aren't reflective of current analysis. But there is a significant range in figures.
Great, thank you. Do you have anything for the last minute, Matt?
Maybe I'll just add the comment that it's become quite clear to us that the concept of pay equity is simple, but rather the process of implementation is somewhat less so. Thinking about the broad recommendations back in the 2004 report, are there any complexities that we should be thinking about as we look at those that would be of significance to Treasury Board or ESDC? And perhaps if I have time, I'll comment on that again.
Well, one of the things I mentioned is the pay equity committees and the balance on the pay equity committees. I think that's important. I think the notion that pay equity ought not be part of the collective bargaining process is one that's important to respect. I think that moving forward, that we need to ensure that we measure on an ongoing basis. We have a mechanism within government to, on an ongoing basis, measure progress on this. That we have a tool within government to measure progress on pay equity going forward on an ongoing basis, and to monitor and to assess and to advise of ways we can improve. I think that's important, so that it's not just a one-time thing. This is a work in progress that will continue over a longer period. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, that's your time. And we have a question now from Ms. Benson for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Minister Bryson, I just want to follow up with you, and we have heard at the committee about the Public Sector Equitable Compensation Act, that it wasn't something that people welcomed, and there were lots of issues with it, and particularly when it came to pay equity, because it had it as a bargaining, not as a fundamental right, and you mentioned that, as well as sort of now including kind of the market mechanism piece, and so that's definitely something that I've heard at the committee. And I think the other piece you've mentioned is the leadership role the federal government can play in a variety of areas. And I guess I'm saying this is a key place where we can step up and have others come after, but to sort of work in our own sort of federally regulated sort of area to make a difference. Because what we did hear from the federally regulated private sector folks last night was, although they didn't, you know, they were kind of worried and not really welcoming something, they felt they were doing a good job, but they couldn't share with us any kind of statistics as to how good they were doing, how far they had come, where they were going. And so I just want you to comment on the importance of being sort of, you know, sort of reporting out on how we're doing as a way to sort of be a leader.
Well, you can't manage what you don't measure, and so doing that within government is important. I think we can do a better job. I think federally regulated industries, you know, have a responsibility to provide good information on this. This is really important for us to understand. I think this point of leadership, though, in terms of what we do as government on this, and I think it goes in terms of in politics, in terms of candidates, in terms of the forming of cabinets. I think all of this makes a significant difference. But I would agree with you in terms of reportage. We ought to expect better reportage on these. We have. I've given you some of the data within government, but there's a lot of data that we do need better data. I mentioned that in terms of the younger cohort, under 35, the gap is not as great, but there's a real issue in that the average age of new hires in the federal public service is 37. It's one of the reasons why I want us to do more in terms of attracting millennials to the public service. We have a world-class public service, but we also have a demographic reality of a lot of really great public servants who are going into retirement age. Young people and the millennials want to make a difference. You can really make a difference in the lives of Canadians in the public service. We feel that will help in terms of gender parity as well. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And we'll go on to our second round. And the first 7-minute question will be for Mr. Sheehan.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for your information so far, and I've appreciated your comments in particular on some of the matters related to Canada's Indigenous people and newcomers. The committee knows that we've heard information over and over again about the gap is much larger in those two particular areas. And being from Northern Ontario, and I've mentioned before, I'm not Indigenous, but my daughter is, my wife is, and they're Métis. They have the blood of Ojibwe in them, and my niece is Inuit. And I really appreciated, you know, your comments on those matters, and the comments about, you know, sort of starting from within ourselves and taking a look at the gender parity in cabinet and in the boardrooms that are so important to, you know, begin that dialogue within ourselves and to start elevating that discussion. And I thank all the committee here, because there's been very, you know, we've been given a very important mandate, and we've sat down and we've devoted a lot of time, which is necessary in a very short period of time. And I appreciate you coming out here on the Tuesday. One of the things that we've been talking about too is measurement. One of the difficult issues of pay equity is measurement. So, you know, my first question that I'd like to ask is, you know, what methods of measurements has the departments historically used to determine the success or challenges associated with pay equity? Sort of, what are your opinions on that? I know Minister Mahaichuk had talked about the Canada Post taking 30 years to resolve an issue. We've heard about Bell Canada, you know, taking 15 years and such. But what I would like is sort of just your comments on measurements that have been used, and perhaps how we should be measuring this going forward.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing that the Labour Department actually, or the Labour program, does not measure or ask companies to report on pay equity. We ask them to report on gender issues and on diversity. So when they do their reporting, they'll say, you know, we have made certain progress here and there, but we actually don't go into pay equity. Many of them have been incorporated, like I say, through other provincial requirements. Like I said, 84% of the private sector companies are now within the Ontario and Quebec proactive regimes. But it is important to then for you to consider exactly what measurements. And that is how we monitor, use data and science to see whether we're making progress or not. So at this point, the present regime doesn't. We've seen some significant changes because women and unions have launched complaints. We have a complaint system right now, and took Canada Post 30 years. I noted that the Peterborough Public Library was just finally awarded compensation. CUPE took them and complained. It started in 2011, and they had a relatively swift result, coming to conclusion February 2016. But still such a long, protracted, costly procedure. And every one of these hearings is probably represented by legal counsel, and it's all very formal and litigious, right? So the Human Resources Professional Association has just issued a white paper on April 12th of this year, and the name of that report is Closing the Gender Wage Gap, a Review and Recommendations. And 912 professionals were surveyed in that report, and it actually cites that StatsCan estimates the wage gap between 12 to 31.5%. And when we look at those numbers, I think it's clear that if we look at our Indigenous people, they are in general earning less than the regular population. And if you are a female and Indigenous, it is twice as bad because things are even more challenging. I'll never forget that I was involved with a program to try and get women to be heavy equipment operators from local reserve, and the point was many of them would make excellent drivers. Women are easier on heavy equipment. They don't rev the motors as much. They're more gentle to the touch. They like large toys. They can handle it. But as soon as a woman would be interested in going, she would lose her housing. Her kids would not have a school. Their supports wouldn't be there. And somehow our system does not provide that transition, which is oh so important. And then it goes into the bigger wage gap, right? So that if women were able to be operating the large equipment, they would then be more likely to make a healthy wage and participate in our economy. But those kind of systemic problems occur, whether it's in chemistry or in geoscience, and my background in minerals. We could make it into the laboratory or generally into the VP level, but it was very difficult to go even higher. But the number of women that are mine managers is tiny, less than 2%. And it's not that there aren't women with enormous experience and are capable. These are systemic discriminatory issues that come from the culture of kind of a boys sort of culture. And, you know, for years and years, they felt if you put a woman underground, you know, that would be unlucky. I always remember that there was a mine in Snow Lake. It had the highest number of women underground in Canada, and that very mine won the safest mine in Canada 2 or 3 times in a row. So many of those women, the mine shut down, like is typical for many, and they're all now tellers at the bank or whatever, but they tell me they'd be glad to go underground if given the opportunity.
Thank you very much. We'll move to the next question from Ms. Gladue, and you have 7 minutes.
Excellent. I'll be sharing my time with Mr. Albus. And my question is for Minister Mahaichuk. One of the things that we've heard when we've been listening to what is making the wage gap up, part of it is the hourly wage or the annual salary. Part of it's a bonus compensation. And we heard from Statistics Canada that they don't have the granularity to be able to tell or get some transparency to what's happening there. So I know you're undertaking some EI reforms, and you're probably working closely with your CRA counterparts. And I'm just thinking if there was a way on people's T4 slips or something of getting granularity to see what, to break down the total compensation so you can plug the holes where discrimination is happening, that would be good. And then I did have the multiple sclerosis folks come by for a visit today, and they had told me that 4 times as many women as men are subject to MS. And as part of that, a lot of times it's a recurring disease so that they have recurring absences in the workplace. And the other side of the thing we've been looking at is, why do women leave the workplace? Sometimes it's disease, sometimes it's elder care, but any way that we can make an adjustment or a reform in the EI system to help compensate for that would be great, if you could comment.
Well, the bonus system is very prominent and common, especially in the private sector. And the higher you go up in the company, this is something that can make a significant difference. And we've all heard stories of, and the statistics show that women haven't really been raised in the culture of saying, I deserve $1 million, or whatever the bonus. And we don't play hockey in general, so we're not privy to sort of sharing what is common. So sometimes we don't know how to ask. Other times we don't have the confidence to. And it's a very good idea to have a look with CRA to see if we can get a handle on that. And we might follow up on that for sure. In terms of MS, this is a particularly large problem, especially in the prairies. We have a very high number of people, most of them women, that have this disease, and it comes and goes. I'm very proud to say that part of my mandate is to look at EI and compensation, which is much more flexible. So if people need to leave, let's hold their position and they'll come back. So we are definitely looking at opportunities like that, and we'll put that into the mix. Thank you for your comments.
Over to you, Mr. Albus.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Minister, we spoke earlier, and even in your own opening comments, our government wants to reach out and engage with stakeholders and partners to come up with timely, workable solutions. Again, you've said a few times that a big part of your process is to work with stakeholders to find consensus. But when you have FEDCO, when you have the Canadian Bankers Association representing 2/3 of the federally regulated workforce, saying they have very real concerns, and it doesn't sound like they were consulted, because I think as far as the amount of consultation that's been done has been through this committee process, and they felt rushed. What do you say to that?
Well, it's a good point, and sometimes it's very difficult to get consensus. We try to move with the best collaboration we can. So this is a perfect sort of venue to hear from all of the stakeholders. Look for a system that is going to give time and a process to allow companies to meet the new demands and make that reality. But I must point out that in 2013, the previous government went ahead with a series of changes that were directly opposed by unions and the labor movement, increasing
talking about the private sector, though, right now, specifically. There are concerns right now.
There is concerns, as I was saying. Whenever you have a system that is going to pit one group, either labor or private sector, in a position which puts them under an extreme, like a disadvantage. For instance, like the 40 trade unions, women's groups, and human rights organizations that supported PSAC in their appeal
Minister, I'm asking
because
about
of
private
the
sector
2013
concerns.
legislation. That put the situation in unbalanced.
Okay,
and what
well-
we keep on talking about is actually making it a relationship that works for everyone.
Minister, I just would like to just go back.
Minister Bryson also wanted to answer that
Actually,
question.
Madam Chair, I'm questioning the witness, please. Thank you. Telecommunications, banking, grain handling, uranium mining, pipelines, Canada Post, Via Rail, airports, navigation, airlines, trains across provincial borders, marine shipping, ferry, port services, trucks and buses that cross provincial borders. That's a very, very wide amount. We've even had people from, staff from your department come and actually say to try to use a one-size-fits-all for such a very diverse marketplace, Minister, is a big challenge. Are you using just this committee? And I do admit that this is a great committee, great members, great process, great chair, but is this the only consultation you've done towards this process?
What we do know is that 84% of the companies that are in the federally regulated industries operate in Ontario and Quebec and are actually covered by proactive pay equity legislation very successfily. Now, we will work very closely with the 16% that have not been already included to be sure that we look forward to your comments from this process.
But I'm looking forward to your comment on my question, which is specific. Have you done the consultation? Because this is a wide range of employees, and I'm not saying you've dismissed 2/3 of the representatives that voiced their concerns, but I'm starting to get a little worried that if this is the only process for consultation on what could be quite a large step, and I'm not saying again that I'm opposed, but I just would like to know that there has been more consultations with this very wide variety of people.
And actually, the time is up. I know Minister Bryson did want to answer, but we'll have to do that in the beginning of the next round, if that's okay.
Was raised. It's up to you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I think we'll do that in the next round.
I have
Okay, and we will go to Ms. Benson for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Actually, I guess a couple of comments. I think what we've heard around this table from witnesses that the 2004 task force report was world class. It was one of the best done, and I'm not just saying that because Professor Bilson is from Saskatoon, but, I'll add that there. First woman chair of a labor relations board and whatnot. So it was ahead of its time. It was extensive, and that's what we've heard over and over again. The other thing we've heard are 3 sort of main points, and I guess I would like your comments on it. One was that it needs to be proactive legislation. It needs to cover both the public and the private sector. That the skill set and the expertise needed to do pay equity the reason it needs to be in a standalone type of legislation is sort of the point, Minister Michalczyk, that you mentioned earlier, is that it takes a skill set and an expertise that isn't found in other places. And if the resources aren't there within the Canadian Human Rights Commission or within the Canada Labour Department, then those things don't get done. What we heard, in the first round in 2004, the private sector employers did support it with some reservations, but there is contained in those recommendations the flexibility in employer size, and whatnot. I think the other point to make is that the complaint-based process allowed employers, when there were settlements for pay equity, to pay less, like 50 cents on the dollar for settlements. And that means that in some ways there was a bargaining away of pay equity. And you can imagine what that would be like if you've been waiting for 30 years for a pay equity. You are going to start to take a 50-cent dollar for but that is not pay equity. So I think, I strongly believe that this committee will provide you with the guidance based on some pretty credible witnesses and some consistency in what people are saying that we've talked to. And I guess I'm just asking for your general comment on those. The last thing is to have a timeline. And what we heard in Quebec is it did take a little bit longer, but that's because there was one of the firsts, and it was challenged by the unions because they were going to exclude the private sector. The private sector is now included. So there are two large jurisdictions that have gone ahead of us, and so I think we can move forward. And I guess point blankly, it'd be nice to know if you'd be supportive of enacting standalone proactive pay equity legislation in this mandate. And I'd ask you both.
Certainly. Firstly, the policy approach for proactive pay equity is one that's very complex, is one that involves public sector, but also federally regulated employers. And it's one, Mr. Albus asked an important question. Any legislative approach we take as a government will consult broadly, but don't underestimate the importance of the consultations that this committee is doing. And when you have an employer group here before this committee, it's really important. We are not operating parliamentary committees as branch plants of ministers' offices. These are important legislative creators of policy and recommendations, and we respect the work you're doing. And so the work you're doing is very important, but in terms of any legislative approach we take, of course there will be a broad level of consultation as part of that. And I want that to be clear. But again, this committee's work and the independence of this committee is important. But don't underestimate the time required to get this right in terms of the complexity of this issue. We need to have the right data. We need to have the best methodologies. And I would believe that you're studying some of the wage comparison methodologies, job to job, job to line, line to line, job to segment, some of these, and the pros and cons of each in some of these areas. This is an area of public policy that I think Mr. DeCourcy said is the principle of it is simple. We all understand that as a committee, as a parliament. Getting it right is the part in something as big as the public service and all federally regulated industries is really important. And our Parliamentary Secretary of Treasury Board, Joyce Murray, has experience as a provincial minister in British Columbia, as does Minister Mahaichuk. We can learn from and draw from those examples of provincial governments in Canada and governments in other countries as we look at the best way to move forward, and that should be part of a process that is more comprehensive.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the previous system of a complaints-based was a failure. That we've seen cases that took 15 years, 30 years to go through the system, enormous costs and pain through that whole process. So a proactive approach seems to be working in Ontario and Quebec. I think that we're open to hear. You're getting firsthand knowledge from the very best of individuals from across the country. We're anxious to hear what you have to say, and of course we'll be consulting with unions, with private sector, with youth, and of course with our partners in the private sector.
That's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much. And the next question will go to Mr. DeCourcy for 7 minutes.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and once again, I appreciate the acknowledgement of the complexity around implementation of pay equity. I would like to echo the comments of Mr. Albus that this is a great committee, and there has been a lot of good witness testimony come before us, and largely there has been a commitment shown from the members here to make sure we get this right and do the right proactive and put in place the right proactive model, including potential legislative and other steps to do that. I wonder, looking at some of the provincial legislation, both Quebec and Ontario, that covers public and private sectors, as well as some of the other provinces that covered simple public, or not simple, sorry, but the public sector. Do either ministries, are they looking at lessons that can be learned from the provinces? And is there any advice that you can provide to us of where we should look into some of those provincial models to help with our final recommendations?
Well, I know that we look forward to the results of the Ontario wage gap review. That will help inform us on that. And I believe, as a committee, are you looking at some provincial examples as well in terms of like Quebec and Ontario? It would be very helpful to us identifying any best practices or approach that can help inform our way forward. From this committee, it would be that would be helpful, including so that would be helpful as well. But as I mentioned, that's one of the things we're looking forward to in terms of Ontario's wage gap review, which is forthcoming, I believe. When do we? In the autumn, we're expecting that.
So, absolutely, we're going to look at best practices. Some of the jurisdictions have been doing this for 20, 30 years that they've been through the process. So there's been some knowledge already gained. And the Human Resources Professional Association white paper is obviously timely. It's brand new. It was recently issued. And we'll look at international best practices with regards to pay equity. If we look at Sweden, the 2009 Discrimination Act requires employers and employees to endeavor to equalize and prevent differences in pay and other terms of employment between men and women who perform work. In France, there is the 2006 Act on Equal Pay between Men and Women. Switzerland has an act that they brought in 1994, the Federal Act on Public Procurement. And in the UK, firms are encouraged to implement gender-neutral job evaluation schemes. So I think that we have an opportunity to look at a broad-based experience from various jurisdictions, and it'll help us make one of the best systems possible.
Something else we've heard from groups who I would characterize as proponents of the 2004 report is perhaps recommending that government look to that report, but try and implement in a staged approach, perhaps with more flexibility to make it more palatable to work through the process of implementation. Have you heard that type of testimony in your outreach and consultations and delving into this file?
Well, just to that point, in terms of flexibility, the federal private sector is actually dominated by small and medium-sized firms with fewer than 100 employees. Working with those firms and hearing concerns and moving forward, but recognizing that there are challenges faced potentially by smaller employers. I think we have to listen to those, and as we move forward. And the Bilson report is very helpful in terms of informing. But again, Bilson itself, recognized the complexity of this, and I mentioned earlier the importance, for instance, in committees dealing with pay equity, to have a balance between employer and employees. I think that's something that's important and may not have been part of Bilson at that time. I think it's something that I would urge the committee to consider.
Madam Chair, timing, 2 minutes. Julie, did you have a question?
I'm not sure. I have a comment.
Sonia has a question.
Okay, go ahead.
My question to Minister Bryson. Yesterday we had testimony from Serena Fung from Catalyst, and we heard about their Gap Inc. And we also had testimony from bankers that adopt their own living wage that ensured pay equity. Do you see any volunteer model like these being effective?
One of the the issue around living wage and there's a, we often don't recognize excellence and social progress as practiced by or implemented by corporate Canada. We sometimes overlook that, but I heard a really good one a while ago, and Craig Alexander was chief economist of TD Bank, and he got a phone call one time from Ed Clark, who was CEO of the bank, and he wanted to do an analysis in the TD Bank of their lowest paid people in their branches to consider if they were receiving a living wage, and taking into account cost of living and other factors. The analysis came back, and people got a pay raise at the lower end, and it came out of people at the higher end. And that was from a bank CEO at one of Canada's largest and most successful banks. So this issue of living wage and inequality, inequality is bad socially. It's bad economically as well. This is something that's really important as we're moving forward in terms of. I know I don't want to. I'm getting off topic a little bit, and I'm sorry about that. But there are rapid changes in terms of automation, globalization, automation, and some of the governments are going to have some level of foresight and analysis in terms of what the impact will be. We talk about gender-based analysis in terms of our decisions here. We should also have gender-based analysis in terms of looking ahead at the global trends in terms of the nature of work, and be considering how we can preemptively approach social and economic policy, including education, skills, and training.
Thank you very much. And no, my apologies.
Tangent too short to follow.
My apologies for having to cut you off on several questions, but we did want to make sure that it's fair for all the members to be able to ask questions.
I apologize.
That does finish that round of questioning. We have a couple of minutes left. If the ministers, any of the questions you did receive that you didn't get a chance to fulsomely reply to, if you'd wish to have some closing statements or reply to those questions now, this is your opportunity.
I just want to encourage you to work on the file, work quickly. We're anxious to get your report, and clearly the time from the enthusiasm we saw in the House, this is something that a lot of our members care about, and I know that the public in general is watching your activities with great interest. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the committee too. And I must say I have served in opposition. I've served in government. I've been on parliamentary committees a lot over the years, and this one seems to have a good sense of cooperation, collaboration, and nonpartisanship. And I think that's great. We do value the work of parliamentarians, committees, and we look forward to the results of this. Leave you with a couple of points. One, pay equity reform is only part of the solution to the gender wage gap. Mr. Hajdu pointed out some of the other areas, and I think we've had some discussion in terms of how to close that gap. Pay equity is part of that. Secondly, any pay equity reform needs to manage the complexity both on the policy side but also on the implementation side. We as politicians tend to focus 90% of our effort on policy and about 10% on implementation, and that's why a lot of times we get great policy and lousy implementation. So we need to get the implementation right. On this, we need to have. It's really important, even classifications of jobs and these things. There are enormous complexities to this, and your work can actually help, including the choice of evaluation tools over the long term and having some flexibility in those. Lastly, on the issue of compliance, in a proactive model, the expectation will be that all employers comply within established timeframes. The experience in other jurisdictions indicates that the non-compliance is a significant problem. I'd like us to understand where that non-compliance, what's generating that. Let's not ignore challenges in terms of the implementation in other jurisdictions. Let's be honest, about what the challenges are here, and be able to deal with them as we move forward. If we don't, then this will be an exercise in policy. And again, getting the implementation of this is critically important, because I think we all broadly agree on the policy imperative. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and look forward to your report, and look forward to working with you as we move forward as a Parliament on this. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour une discussion très dynamique.
Thank you very much for a very dynamic discussion.
Members for adding a special day for this committee meeting, and we will see all of you tomorrow at 5:30. Thank you. Adjourned.